Good evening, everybody. This is Scott with Duck Sports Authority, and I'm joined by Drew Davis as always. I think we're going to call this a postmortem for the Rose Bowl. It feels like that a little bit when you talk to some of the fans. I watched Ryan Winters last night. And he was pretty emotional watching him upset about, I think, just, the end of the season, right? This is something, the expectations for more than the quarterfinal really, I think, took their toll on emotions from around the fan base. I'm sure it did with the coaches and the players as well, because it's never easy to not meet what you expected to meet and then to try to deal with what happened, went wrong. I saw a lot of things that I think I saw, but I'm going to let you start and tell me what the first thing you saw that really was off on yesterday afternoon.
Yeah, I think the first thing that was off really yesterday afternoon is you watched it. We send our defense out there and they come up with a quick score, and I'm like, okay, well, we have to come back and score and kind of make it a ball game, and went three and out. And usually we've been really good at responding this year. And so that was a real red flag for me, where I was like, okay, we talked about rust. We talked about starting slow when we first got on here last week, and we wondered how the layoff would be. I didn't think it was going to be a problem. But I think Ohio State was just rocking with some momentum. And instead of them coming out and saying, okay, we're going to run the ball, they pretty much put the ball in the wide receivers' hands and their playmakers' hands. And if you would have told me that G. Scott was going to get the first play of the game from Ohio State, I would have bet $1 million he wasn't. But that's a 20, 30-yard gain to start out the drive for them. So for us, I just knew I knew right away that we were going to have our work cut out for us defensively. But then just to know that they were back there throwing the ball and going to make us cover, and knowing, in my opinion, our back end isn't the best or the strength of our defense, I knew that was going to make it for a long day.
Yeah, I agree. I think the thing that I noticed, I was sitting in the stadium yesterday, and that's the weird part about where the ESPN place was. They were set up inside the stadium, so there were no fans behind them, but I was sitting there listening to Nick Saban talk, and I couldn't see his chalk talk. I couldn't see the monitor. I could just hear what he was saying. And what I think I saw is a lot of the same things that happened against Penn State were still happening. And what he pointed out, I don't know if you watched the ESPN segment with him where he's talking about defensive backs in man coverage looking in the backfield instead of at their man. And if that's what you're doing when you're in man coverage, he said, you're in trouble because you've lost your eye discipline. The moment you lock onto the quarterback while you're in man coverage, you're in trouble, especially against good receivers. And if we thought Penn State's receivers were good, we knew that Ohio State's were better. I mean, Jeremiah Smith, I hate calling people generational, because at the end of the day, most of the time they're not. They're just really good elite players, even at the next level. Generational is a Randy Moss, right? You get once a generation, and we've called several people, I think, in the last 10 years, generational talents. And I don't know that all of them have panned out that way. But he is definitely generational at the college level, because he's big, he's strong, he's fast, and nobody could cover him. And I think that was the biggest difference for me early is they understood, where's our advantage? Wide receivers and defensive backs. Why should we go somewhere else if that's where the advantage is? Don't try to push. And I think that's Chip Kelly. That's Chip Kelly learning from his past mistakes. We are better at the passing game right now. Why should we try to force the run game when we have Jeremiah Smith, Carnell Tate, and Emeka Mbuka and G. Scott out there? We have 4 really good receivers. Why should we force the running game up the middle where we know they're going to be ready for it? And I think they did a good job adjusting the game plan. And the funny part is, I looked at just to see if Will Howard's numbers were better this game or not. The first quarter numbers were obviously better. He had over 200 yards passing in the first quarter. But if you look at his game numbers, he had a lower completion percentage. He had slightly fewer yards. The difference was yards per completion and yards per attempt were significantly better. I think yards completion the first time were 11.2, and it was 18.6 in this game. When you have 18.6 yards per completion, that's a good day. And it doesn't matter that you only completed 65% instead of 80. It matters that what you did hit was a big play over the top, and Oregon did not have answers. And I think what I saw Ohio State do is they put different pressure packages on Dylan Gabriel early to throw the offense off the game, because they knew if they could get consecutive scores and put Oregon where they were playing catch up, that's a different story than playing back and forth. And I think they
Mhm.
changed some things up, and it was clear because they were getting to Dylan Gabriel a lot in this game. 8 sacks, 13 tackles for loss. They did a lot of different things on their defensive line that really rattled. I don't want to say rattled. I don't think it rattled it. It just created a lot of problems for the Oregon offense. The line just couldn't make the plays they needed to make. They weren't athletic enough. They weren't in the right position. They just were missing a lot of things. And I think once it got to 21-0, you kind of knew that it was going to take a Herculean effort for a comeback. Um, what I would say that I was impressed by is that they didn't quit. I know a lot of people thought in the second quarter when it's 34-0 that they had quit, but they didn't. They came, they scored a touchdown, got a 2-point conversion, they scored a touchdown at the beginning of the third quarter. They did the things they had to do to try to get back in this game. And I think when they got the 3-and-out after the getting to the second touchdown, they got a 3-and-out right away. There was that little glimmer, but it was dashed really quick, right? They got the ball back and didn't do anything with it. And then Ohio State got the ball back after that, scored again, and then I think you knew that's it. That there is no more left in this, because anytime Ohio State wanted something, all they had to do was drop back and throw a pass. And they were going to complete at least, 6 out of 10 of them, and they were going to get big plays out of them. And that's once that was done, I think it was kind of a known factor. And the weakness, it's the defensive backfield. I think, Oregon signed some really good elite talent, but they're still not quite there with elite defensive backs that can hang with this kind of receiving core. One of the things I think I saw out there in Twitterverse, it's always fun to read, but it's sort of true. Jabbar Muhammad was the best defensive back on the team this year, but if he was an elite lockdown corner, would he have still been in college?
Mhm.
That's a good question. He would, if he was an elite lockdown corner, he might already be gone. And so I think that kind of is good stopgaps. These were better than what Oregon had 3 years ago at the defensive backfield, but they're still not up to the Jeremiah Smith level. There's some things I think, and I'll let you chime in, some things I think I see about the rest of the season that kind of led us to this, what I call a mirage.
Uh-huh.
And I say that because if you're in the desert and you see what you think is water way out in the distance, you go to it and you think, oh man, that's going to be great water when I get to it. And you get there and it's not there, but you don't know that it's a mirage until you get there. And I think the Big Ten created a mirage for Oregon a little bit. How many good passing teams did Oregon face this year?
Not many.
Ohio State and Penn State. That was it. And so they didn't know until they got to the quarterfinal what they didn't have. That pass defense looked really good all season long, but that's against Illinois, Wisconsin, and anything toward them. They just don't have a good passing game, right? Illinois, Wisconsin, Boise State doesn't have a good passing game. Idaho doesn't really have a good passing game. UCLA doesn't have a good passing. You look at the teams that stacked up, there weren't a lot of good passing teams in there. And so this mirage happened. And I haven't formulated it for the formal written article that I want to do on it, but it was a mirage that you thought was real until yesterday. And that's kind of the take I get from a bigger picture.
Yeah. And I know what you mean there. And it's tough, hindsight's 2020 when you look back at it and everything like that. But like I said, you said they have four really good receivers. And the only thing that was really stopping them this year was them as far as putting the ball in those guys' hands. But we also I was at the game as well, and I just didn't hear names getting called. And when I say that to people, they're like, "What do you mean?" I'm like, "Well, I heard Derek Harmon on one tackle, but I didn't hear about a Jordan Birch. I didn't hear about a Bryce Betcher on plays. Like, and when you're one step away against high elite level guys like they have, you just take one bad angle or one missed tackle, and they're running for 66 yards down the sideline. So the thing I will say about Chip Kelly is when you're a good play caller and when you have it going for you, you're 2 or 3 plays ahead of the defense. They're trying to stop a play from 2 or 3 plays ago, and you're already thinking, okay, this next play is a touchdown. We already got them their eyes in the right or their wrong or right place, however you want to put it, and we're going to go ahead and take our shot, and we know it's going to be there because these guys are like really just holding on and just trying to stay in the game right now and just trying to grab at anything they can. And so just I thought it's funny out coming out in this, I think it was the second quarter, I thought they would take a shot on that very first play. They did a running play and bust for it. But I just knew I was just like I knew we were like a play or two behind, and it was just tough to watch because you can just see them just kind of tinkering with stuff and just like firing on all cylinders, if you will.
Yeah, and I think the other thing we talked about last week and with Ted was the reality that the offensive linemen who were out of position and struggling earlier in the season against Penn State, against Nebraska, they had 3 weeks to practice and understand their craft better. And it was very clear that they were better than they were against Penn State. That offensive line did their job well. And were there a couple of times you got some hurries on Will Howard and, some pressure? Yes, but he didn't get sacked. And he did, but they called it a rush for a loss, which whatever. That's a statistic that doesn't really matter at this point, but they did a much better job than I expected. Donovan Jackson, he was an All-American at guard for a reason, and he really adapted well by the end of the season right now to playing left tackle. And that's a hard transition, and I think he used that time off between the Michigan loss and the Tennessee game to really hone his craft and get better as a left tackle and understand his footwork and his hand, all those little things that make you technically sound. He did better. He's still going to be a guard, I think, at the next level, but he's doing a good job right now in a tough situation. And I thought the 3 weeks really helped that unit out a lot. If you didn't hear Mateo Uyunglele, you didn't hear Jordan Burch, you didn't hear Tatum Tuioti, you didn't hear Blake Purchase, who was the other defense edge rusher that came in. Bryce Betcher got a couple of good plays, but there weren't a lot of good plays being made by the front seven. Everything was defensive backfield making tackles because balls were going downfield and nobody was stopping it. And Travion Henderson was getting a 66-yard gain and nobody was touching him. I mean, everything that could go wrong did in a way, and yet it never felt like it was even as close as it ended up. It never felt like 41-21. It felt like 56-0. It felt 59-20. And if I'm going to use the 2015 game, it just felt like that the whole game because it was such a big lead early that, after we were watching the Texas game in the press box and watching Arizona State come back from their deficit, it was 24-8, and they came back and could have and should have won. There was that thought that people thought just maybe it could happen. And I just didn't see it because I didn't see Oregon making stops enough to make a comeback. And that's the biggest thing. To make a comeback, you got to get a bunch of stops back to back to back while also not getting stopped yourself. And that game it didn't seem like it was going to play out that way because Ohio State was just at a different level. And now we'll get your thoughts on, was the system flawed? Should this game have been in the Rose Bowl? Should this have been a matchup later in the season? Would it have mattered?
It's tough to say with everything, but I will say about reseeding, and I know it's kind of hard, but when you're like, okay, we've seen this matchup already. I don't make any excuses about who we had to play, where we had to play them for the most part, but all the teams that had a bye lost. Now you also wouldn't say, okay, well the teams that won their conference, they need to play in the first round and they need to have home field advantage. But it's a thing where you look in maybe 2 or 4 years out where there can be changes or adjustments. But you just look at the whole system overall and you're just like, there's always going to need to be tweaks for everything. But how do you reward somebody that does win their conference? You know what I mean? Like NFL, if you're in the number one seed in that division or in that conference, you get the bye. And usually people don't look at that as a bad thing, but then you can also look at it from Ohio State side, who the thing with going into a playoff or the playoffs is that you get hot at the right time. You
Right.
suffered that loss when it didn't matter. And the one worry I had about this year, and I know we talked about it earlier, is I said, man, I don't want to have to play Ohio State 3 times. And I also talked to somebody and I said, if you asked me when did I want to lose to Ohio State, if any, it would have been early, because if we knew we are going to meet a couple times in the year or later in the year, you also know that later in the year, that's for the Big Ten championship. That's for that's for to move on the next round in the playoffs. And so when you think about it like that, I just hated that they got the last laugh. We can talk about what we did in the season in October and the kind of fuss about that. But when it comes down to it, they're moving on. They're playing next week. They're still in the hunt for the national title. And we had an undefeated season where we just fell short in one of the biggest games of the year for us. And so it's really tough to really say, hey, what should the change be or what could be different? But I don't feel like the number one seed got a path that was favorable to them to be successful in the playoffs, if that makes sense.
It does. And I don't think any of the really elite teams well, some did because they lost at the time that made it beneficial to them to lose. And the one thing I'll say about the NFL playoffs, yes, the division champion may get a bye, but they're not taking 4-week buys. They're taking a 1 week off where the other teams are playing that first week and then they play the second week. A 1 week buy, I think, would be great. The only way to make that happen is if you move up everything so that the playoffs start the week after the conference championship games, the quarterfinals are the week after that, the semifinals are the week after that, and you have and I think, who was it that put it out there? Joel Klatt, I think, put it out there, that you should have that so that, he said the Rose Bowl should be the national championship game every year. And while I love the site, and I would agree with that because it would make it so much better for me to get to on a yearly basis, I don't think that's going to happen. I think it's going to have to rotate. And I know the Rose Bowl wants to keep their game on the traditional first. So I don't know if you could ever make it work to move up the playoffs so that there is no big gap for anybody. That would be the simplest solution to saying we want to make sure that the top seeds that get a bye don't somehow get hamstrung by the fact that they took a month off. And I know that Dan said they did practice hard, and it is not the same. I think you would agree. Doing practices is not the same as game week. And we have 4 weeks off. It's just, there is a rhythm that can get lost, that there's only so much you can do to try to make it back up. And it became very clear that Oregon did get into a rhythm in this late second quarter. They were just too far behind for that rhythm to make a difference at that point. They took the one deep shot to Tez and it bounced off his helmet. They did a couple of things. Trajan Holden had a great game. Mm-hmm. I expected him to have a great game for a different reason, but he had a great game being that guy that couldn't be covered while they were focusing on Tez. It didn't help that Evan Stewart was out. It didn't help that Jordan James went out early in the game with an apparent head injury, is what I was told. I don't know. I didn't see it, so I couldn't say that that's what happened. Those didn't help, but it just became this rhythm thing that didn't pick up until it was too late.
Mm-hmm. And just like you said, like once you become one dimensional, it's hard to come back from that. And I think our longest run was by Jordan James in the first quarter, might have been 8 or 12 yards or something. And they did a good job bottling up the run. So anytime you're negative yardage for rushing, it's not going to be good for the end of the game stat line for the final score, because you're too one dimensional. They get to pin their ears back and take off on you. And that's kind of what we've been built on this whole year, is being able to run the ball and being able to kind of get in third and manageables and third and shorts.
8 sacks will do that because that's comes straight out of the rushing stats. But Jordan James had 7 carries for 14 yards prior to his injury anyway. So it's not like they were getting a lot of rushing yards, even if we take out the sacks. And it was pretty telling, I think, as the first play of the game where he ran basically the same counter run to the outside. I call it the outside. It wasn't really the outside. It was off tackle a little bit, but it's the same play he made some big gains on in the first matchup. And he got tackled for a 1 yard loss. It was a shoestring tackle, but it was still a tackle for 1 yard loss. And that was a telling thing that they were in a better position to make those plays at the very start of this game than they were in the first game. They weren't making that play in the first game. They were behind him when he got to that edge, and he was getting 8 to 12 yards every single time he took that particular play. And in this game, it was a different story. And I think, again, that is very telling for how well Jim Knowles planned for this offense. He was able to self-scout what they did wrong. He was able to scout and understand that, look, Will Stein isn't going to change his offense that much. He's not going to all of a sudden run, you know, pulling from the backside if he didn't do it before. He's just not going to do those things, right? He's going to run his offense. And so there are keys. And I think they did a good job of getting ready for those keys. If you ask me, I'll bet you they were scouting Oregon the whole time they were preparing for Tennessee as well. They have an army of analysts. I guarantee you they were scouting Oregon still. And they were prepping game planning for Oregon at the same time they were prepping for Tennessee because they knew what was waiting for them if they got by Tennessee. And they've been probably working on it for a while because they expected to play in the Big Ten championship game. So I think they've been working on some things for a while, but you know, they did everything right. And I don't want to take credit away from them because they played an incredibly good game on both sides of the ball. And even special teams, Oregon, the punting game wasn't great. It just, nothing went right yesterday. It just was a snowball effect. But again, really impressed with the effort that I saw right up to the end. That part, it at least heartens you that this wasn't a team quitting on anybody. This was a team that just got outplayed and they didn't want to quit on their teammates and they didn't want to end on a note of giving up. They fought until it was time to stop fighting.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. The last thing I'll say, or one of the last things I'll say, is went back and looked at the first half today, this morning, and the receivers weren't getting separation from the defenders as well. Everything you looked at, everything Dylan Gabriel looked at, windows were kind of cloudy, or there was a defender right there, so you can call those coverage sacks a little bit. And sometimes they were able to get there with four rushers. And we talk about when you have a good defensive line, and you don't have to necessarily send the blitz the whole time, but you might show blitz and rush your four, and you've had to change the protection and whatnot. But then also that deep ball to Emeka Buka, our guy got a hand on it, tipped it a little bit, and it just still fell right in there, and he was able to grab it and cradle it. So it's a game of inches, and also it's just one of those things you just hate that it's the last game of the year where you play probably the worst game you've played this whole year up against a very, very formidable opponent.
True. And the one thing I heard from a Ohio State writer behind me, he pointed out that was still the second most points that Ohio State gave up all year.
Mm.
That's just how good the Ohio State defense was most of the year. They gave up, the most they gave up outside of Oregon was 17. And Oregon scored 21 and 32 points. So they still played a better game than most offenses play against that defense. I think expectations by Oregon fans were just higher than what they saw. They expected, one, they expected to win. And two, they then expected the winner of this was probably going to advance to the national championship game. That's the belief. Again, Texas could come out and shock the heck out of all of us next week. I doubt it, but they could. Texas has not impressed me in their ability to play big games. The Georgia games, even Arizona State, they did not play well. So I expect Ohio State to beat Texas and get to the national championship game. Notre Dame won tonight, so that's going to be an interesting matchup next week with them in Penn State. It's going to be fun to watch. The one thing we're guaranteed now is there will not be an SEC champion as a national champion. So they can complain all they want. Alabama lost to Michigan. You probably didn't belong in the 12 seed, Alabama. I know they wanted to complain about it, but I'll leave it at that. I think I wanted to do a postmortem just because I think there's still a lot to be thankful about this season. It was a season that most fans, I think, hoped for, didn't expect. I think the wins and the number one ranking got excitement up to a level where hindsight now makes it a lot easier to see where the flaws were. But as you're winning games and the Ducks are putting out the Ducks versus them, and you're seeing all this excitement build, it's difficult to have all that excitement build to then be left flat at the end of the season in the biggest game of the year, the biggest game of since 2015 when Oregon lost to Ohio State in the national championship game. It's that big of a moment. But I think if you look at what's been built in the recruiting pipeline, Lanning's only in his third year. I think it's going to take, what is it, Kirby Smart didn't win his first national championship till 6 years. I think Nick Saban was like 12 or 13 years as a head coach before he won a national championship. All the things that need to be built are there. But as somebody else pointed out, They don't have the same level of talent quite yet that Ohio State has. And when you get into a game like this, when both teams are well prepared, the team with the most talent is most likely to win in this situation. And I think that proved out well yesterday. They had more talent, especially at the edges, the receivers versus DBs. That was a matchup nightmare that I thought was there. It's why I made my prediction when I made it. I didn't like it. I was trying to find a reason to doubt myself, but I just didn't see a way that Oregon was going to stop those guys. I wish they had, but I didn't see it. And I didn't think that Ohio State was going to make the same mistakes they made. They weren't going to have a fumble. They weren't going to have an onside kick bounce off a player. Those things weren't going to happen this game. So it was going to have to be a straight up battle. And unless you find a way to force a turnover, I just didn't see the offense playing as poorly as they did early. So I think for me, the 2025 season still has hope because there's a lot of talent coming back and there's a lot of young talent, I think, that's going to be ready to go. The guys that so far have been added in the portal, the Dylan Thieneman, the Theron Johnson, Bear Alexander, Jamari Johnson, those are guys, and then Alex Harkey and Isaiah World, those are guys that I think are going to be helpful next year. What I'm interested to see now is who comes back. I know they have a portal running back coming on campus this weekend. It happens to be Naeem Offord's brother. I'm interested to see if Jordan James comes back or not. I think running back is a different story than anybody else because short shelf life, right? You got such a short shelf life as a running back. Do you spend another year in college getting beat up at 20 carries a game, or you go ahead and take, even if you're a 5th round draft selection, do you take that just so you can earn a different level? And while we think NIL offers these guys a lot of money, it's not the same. Yeah. It's not the same as the signing bonus you get and the other perks you get even as a 5th rounder, right? It's a different world up there. But I'm interested to see if Josh Connerly comes back. I know he had a great game against Penn State. I don't think any of the offensive linemen had a great game yesterday. So I'm interested to see that. I don't have any inside knowledge right now about which way he's leaning. I know there's some people who think he's a 1st round pick. And if he is, I would say he goes. You'd be silly not to at this point. But so we'll see what his grade comes back at, because I think we'll start hearing that within the next less than 2 weeks, right? I think they have till the 15th.
Yep.
So that'll be interesting. I'm looking forward to 2025 because I think there's still a lot of good that we got from this season. I think the defense is better than it was 2 years ago, and I think they'll be better next year than they are this year.
I'll go ahead and say, just for me personally, I've watched Duck football since I've left there. It's a lot more difficult to watch the older you get, as far as like not knowing people or just having to stay up to date with people. So I appreciate doing this podcast with you. For me, I've sat down and I've been sitting there with a notebook, and I always do it cerebrally, looking at the game and saying, oh, they did this. This is on but actually doing it and sitting down and talking about it with you, Scott, has been definitely a blessing to me, and just being able to talk about Ducks football and make some predictions and say our opinions on what we thought happened. But definitely, Oregon has a lot to hang their hat on. And like you said, this is probably the most excitement since the 2015 national championship year. I have to I have to make a confession. I think I'm gonna stop going to big games, because every time I go to a big game, we lose. I was at the 2015 national championship against Ohio State. I go to the Rose Bowl this year, so I think I'm gonna watch everything from my house from here on out. But it was great to learn about those guys, and listening to the games and listening to the stories of them, and exactly what's going on in their lives and their football journey, with so many people transferring and starting with lower offers, moving up, getting this opportunity. And I just really feel, 2025, you talk about, what players will be leaving and coming back. My thing is, I've thought Will Stein might be up for a head coaching job somewhere, just because of his offensive mind over the last couple of years. And I know he's had great quarterbacks, and so he's stuck around. But my mind is, we a couple of years ago having having Arroyo call the plays, who also went somewhere to, be a head guy, or do some things in another program. So my thing is, how does a program handle that type of success, where you have success, where your assistants start to get elevated and go different places? Are you able to keep that machine going? Who are the next people up that are able to come in? Who are the people that you're promoting? And kind of just like you said, the recruiting is off the chain. It's getting better. He's only in year 3. And so as you look at it more, you're like, okay, well, he's done a lot even leading up to this point. It's going to be really scary once he gets over that proverbial hill and, obtains him, these CFP wins and a national championship berth and things like that. So I think it's a great time in Oregon football. It's a great time to be thankful for all the things that the young men did this year, fighting through adversity, the media, what they're saying, being doubted, and making this season fun with the videos, with just letting us in and to take a peek at everything. So I'm grateful for you, Scott. I'm grateful for the Ducks, and I'm gonna just keep rooting until we get that vaunted national championship that we've been chasing.
And I want to say I'm grateful for you coming on and joining us, because I think it helps us with what we like to do. It helps to have a voice that, one, has been there, and two, has a different viewpoint, right? You bring a different approach to it than maybe I would by myself. And listening to me talk for 30 minutes by myself would be boring as heck for most people anyway. So I really appreciate you joining us. And I know I'll be out in Hawaii so we fly out the 10th. So a week from tomorrow, or a week from Saturday, we fly out to Hawaii for the Polynesian Bowl, where we're going to be covering. There will be 10 Oregon commits at the Polynesian Bowl, at least scheduled to be there. Some of them are already enrolled, so they may show up but be in street clothes the whole time. So we had a chance to talk to them, and I'll share that. We'll do a podcast with Ryan from there as well. So maybe I'll talk to Ryan and see if you want to join us, just to kind of chat about the recruits we're talking about, some of the guys that are going to be on the team next year.
Sounds great.
All right, cool. I appreciate you. I will reach out to you just if there will be some other stuff we do, kind of off-season content that might be interesting for you, that we'll invite you back on.
Sounds good.
All
Looking
right.
forward to it. Now, this year has been amazing. So thank you again.
Awesome. Thanks, Drew. I appreciate it.
All right. Take care, Scott.
Talk to you soon.